Imagine waking up one morning, making your coffee, and looking out your window. And standing right there, in the yard next door, is the most powerful being in the entire universe. Not a celebrity, not a billionaire, not even a world leader, something far, far beyond all of that. She does not just rule a country. She does not just rule a planet. She rules everything. Every galaxy. Every star system. Every living creature across every known dimension of space and time bows to her name. And she chose to live next door to an ordinary guy from Manchester, England. Nobody talks about this kind of story, because most people never survive long enough to tell it. But today, you are going to hear every single detail, because the man at the center of this impossible story decided to write it all down before anyone could stop him. His name is Daniel Carr, a 32-year-old former logistics worker from Northern England who signed up for a deep space relocation program that most people thought was a joke. He paid his deposit, he packed his bags, and he moved to a planet at the edge of the known galaxy. And his neighbor turned out to be her, the queen of everything. Today, this story is going to reveal 3 things that will completely change the way you think about power, about the universe, and about what it means to be human in a cosmos that is far older and far stranger than anyone ever told you. First, you are going to discover what kind of being actually rules the galaxy, and why she has been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. Second, you are going to find out why she chose that specific neighborhood, that specific planet, and that specific house right next door to an ordinary human man. And third, you are going to learn what happened when Daniel finally found out the truth about who she really was, and what she actually wanted from him. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a fantasy. This is the recorded account of one man's impossible life on the edge of the universe. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Daniel Carr was not a remarkable man. He would be the first one to tell you that. He was average height, average build, brown hair that never sat right in the morning, and a laugh that came out a little too loud in quiet rooms. He worked for 6 years in a shipping warehouse on the outskirts of Manchester. He tracked packages. He filled out forms. He drank too much tea and not enough water. He had a small flat with a radiator that clicked all night, and a view of a car park that never seemed to have any cars in it. His life was quiet. Some days it was too quiet. He had friends, sure, a few good ones from his school days, a couple of mates from work. His mom called him every Sunday without fail, and he always picked up, even when he did not feel like talking. He was not unhappy exactly, but he was not exactly happy either. He existed somewhere in the middle, in that soft gray space that a lot of people live in, without ever really noticing. And then one afternoon, while he was eating a cheese toastie and scrolling through his phone, he saw the advertisement. It was not flashy. It was not loud. It was just a small banner at the bottom of a news article he had already forgotten reading. 4 simple words sat there in plain white text on a dark blue background. Ready for something different? Below those words was a logo he did not recognize, and a link that looked almost too simple for something so strange. He almost scrolled past it. He almost closed the tab entirely, but something made him tap the link. Maybe it was the silence in his flat. Maybe it was the clicking radiator. Maybe it was just a Tuesday afternoon in November when the sky outside was the color of old dishwater, and the idea of something different felt like the most important thing in the world. The page that loaded was clean and professional. It had the header of a company called Horizon Relocation Services, and below that was a single line of text that read, "We help ordinary people find extraordinary places to live, including off-world locations across verified habitable territories in the outer sectors." Daniel read that line 3 times. Off-world locations. He thought it was a joke. Some kind of quirky marketing campaign for holiday cottages in Scotland or tiny homes in Iceland. He kept reading, and the more he read, the less it looked like a joke. There were registration documents. There were testimonials from people in places like Ohio and Toronto and Brisbane. There were photographs of real alien landscapes. Purple mountains under twin suns, forests of silver trees that moved like seaweed in slow currents of wind, wide blue plains stretching out under skies full of soft green clouds. He filled out the initial form before he really thought about it. 3 weeks later, a man in a gray suit knocked on his door, sat down at his kitchen table, and explained very calmly that the program was completely legitimate, that humanity had been quietly integrated into a wider galactic community for nearly 40 years, and that for a manageable deposit and a signed relocation agreement, Daniel could choose from 17 available properties on 4 different planets in the outer sectors. Daniel asked what the catch was. The man in the gray suit smiled and said there was no catch. Just a preference that new residents keep a low profile for the first 6 months while they adjusted. Just basic integration guidelines. Be respectful. Learn the local customs. Do not stare. Do not make unnecessary noise after the 3rd evening bell. Simple things. Common sense things. Daniel signed the agreement on a Wednesday. By the following month he was gone. The planet he chose was called Verada. It appeared on page 9 of the listings, and was described as a quiet residential sector in the outer rim of the Calvaran galaxy. Mild climate. Low population density. Excellent connectivity to nearby trade hubs. Affordable. Peaceful. The kind of place where nothing much happened, and that, the listing said cheerfully, was the whole point. The house they assigned him was a modest structure at the end of a curved lane that wound through a neighborhood of similar buildings. The architecture was unfamiliar but not frightening. Soft organic shapes. Walls that seemed to breathe slightly when the wind moved through them. Windows that shifted from clear to frosted depending on the angle of the light. A small garden plot in front with soil the color of dark rust, and 3 stubby plants he could not identify growing near the gate. He arrived on a Thursday, local time, which the relocation agent helpfully explained was technically called the 4th cycle of the Verada Standard Week, and meant nothing different from any other day except that the evening market would be running, and he should probably avoid the eastern lane, if he did not want to get caught in the foot traffic. He unpacked slowly. He set his kettle on the small counter in the kitchen. He put his favorite mug next to it. He arranged his books on the shelf near the front window and stood back and looked at the room and tried to feel at home in a house on a planet 47 light-years from Manchester. It was strange. Of course it was strange. Everything was slightly wrong in the way that new places always are. The proportions were a little off. The ceilings were higher than he was used to. The door handles were positioned slightly lower than seemed natural. There was a faint smell in the air that he could not name, something between clean rain and warm stone, and it should have been comforting, but instead it just reminded him constantly that he was somewhere entirely new. He slept that first night with all the lights on. The next morning he made his tea, stood at the front window and looked out at the curved lane, and the strange rust-colored soil, and the silver light of the Verada sun coming up slow and pale over the rooftops. And that was when he saw her for the first time. She was standing in the garden next door, just beyond a low wall of stacked dark stone. She was tall. Not unnaturally so, but tall in the way that made you aware of it immediately. She had long dark hair that moved even when there was no wind, as if it had its own slow gravity. Her skin was a deep and rich red, the color of embers just before they go dark, and it had a faint luminescence to it, a soft inner glow that caught the pale morning light and made her seem lit from within. She was wearing a simple dark robe, tied loosely at the waist, and she was looking down at something small she held in her hands. Her expression was focused and still, the way someone looks when they are solving something complicated inside their own mind. Daniel stood at his window with his mug halfway to his mouth and stared. She did not look up for a long moment. And then, as if she had always known he was there, she turned her head slowly and looked directly at him through the glass. Her eyes were extraordinary. They were silver and deep, and full of something that Daniel could not name. Something vast and old and utterly calm. They were the eyes of someone who had seen everything and forgotten none of it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded once, the smallest and most precise of nods, and turned back to whatever she held in her hands. Daniel set his mug down carefully on the windowsill. He did not pick it back up for a very long time. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest. Not fear exactly. Not attraction exactly. Something in between those two things that did not have a proper name in any language he knew. A recognition, maybe. The feeling you get when you see something so far outside your experience that your brain simply does not have a file for it and has to start building one from nothing. He stood at that window for another 20 minutes. She did not look up again. He went back to his kitchen, made a second cup of tea, and sat down at his small table. He opened the integration booklet the relocation agent had given him. He flipped to the section on meeting neighbors. The booklet recommended a brief introduction within the first week. A small gesture of goodwill, perhaps a common food item or a simple verbal greeting in the local standard dialect. He read the phonetic guide to the Verada standard greeting 3 times. He practiced it quietly in the empty kitchen. And for the rest of that day, he told himself the feeling in his chest was just the strangeness of being somewhere new. Just the adjustment period. Just the normal disorientation of a man from Manchester who had moved 47 light years from everything he had ever known. He almost believed it. That evening, as the Verada sun went down, and the sky turned a deep and spectacular violet, he heard something from the garden next door. It was soft and low, and unlike anything he had ever heard before. Not quite music, not quite language. Something between the two. A sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than a throat or a chest. Something that resonated in the walls of the house and in the dark rust soil and in the slow evening air of a planet at the edge of everything. He sat very still and listened. And somewhere in that sound, in that impossible and ancient music that had no name in any human language, something small and quiet shifted inside him. He did not sleep that night either. But this time, he did not leave all the lights on. The first week on Verada passed the way first weeks in strange places always do. Slowly and quickly at the same time. Daniel figured out the market. He found the water systems. He learned which of the 3 local food stalls near the eastern lane would sell him something close enough to bread that he could eat it without incident. He learned that the Verada day was 26 hours long, and that the extra 2 hours hit somewhere around midday, and made him feel simultaneously exhausted and restless, in a way he could not explain to anyone back home. He sent a message to his mum. He told her the planet was nice. He told her the neighbors seemed quiet. He did not tell her about the woman next door with the silver eyes and the hair that moved without wind, because he did not yet have the words for her, and because he suspected that if he tried to explain, his mum would call the relocation company and demand a refund. He watched his neighbor from a respectful distance. He could not help it. She was there every morning when he looked out his front window, always in the garden, always still and focused. Sometimes she held things, small objects he could not quite make out from his window. Sometimes, she simply stood with her hands behind her back and looked up at the sky with an expression of complete and absolute calm. She never seemed hurried. She never seemed concerned. She moved through her mornings with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already decided how every day will go, and has never once been wrong about it. On the 5th day, he went outside. He had rehearsed the greeting a dozen times. He had it ready. He walked to the low dark stone wall between their gardens, and he stood there for a moment gathering himself. And then he said it. The words came out almost right. Close enough, he hoped. She turned from what she was doing and looked at him. Up close, she was even more extraordinary than she had seemed through the glass. Her features were precise and symmetrical, in a way that felt almost architectural, as if her face had been designed rather than born. The glow beneath her skin moved slowly, a soft pulse, like something breathing deep inside her. She was perhaps 30 in human terms, though something in her eyes made that estimate feel completely useless. She studied him for a moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and clear and perfectly accented in standard English, the kind of clean universal English that the translation implants all new residents received produced. And she said, "Your pronunciation is acceptable. Most humans do worse." He blinked. He said, "You speak English." She said, "I speak everything." He believed her immediately. He introduced himself. Daniel Carr, from Manchester. Former logistics worker, new to the planet, trying to figure it all out. She listened to all of this with a polite and precise attention, the kind of attention that made him feel simultaneously seen and gently assessed. Then she said her name. It was not a name he could reproduce exactly. It was 3 syllables long, and the middle one existed in a frequency that his ears processed but his mouth could not form. The translation implant rendered it in his mind as something close to Saraval, and that was what he called her from then on, though he knew it was only an approximation of something much larger. She said, "You may call me Sarah." He said, "That is much easier." She looked at him for one more long moment with those silver eyes that held something vast and terribly old inside them. And then, for the first time, she did something he did not expect. She smiled. It was small, precise, controlled, but it was real. And it changed her face in a way that made the morning feel suddenly warmer than the pale Verada sun could account for. She said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Daniel Carr from Manchester." Then she turned and went back inside her house. He stood at the wall for a moment longer, looking at the space where she had been. Then he went back inside his own house and sat down and stared at the wall for a long time, without thinking about anything in particular. He did not know what she was yet. Not really. He would find out soon enough. It was his neighbor across the lane who first said the word. His name was Tyven. He was a Calvaran, a species that looked broadly humanoid, but ran slightly too tall, and had eyes that were almost completely black. He had lived on Verada for 12 local years, and he was, as far as Daniel could tell, the most relaxed individual in the galaxy. He came over on Daniel's 8th day with something that resembled wine, in a bottle that had no label, and he sat in Daniel's front room and drank and talked about the neighborhood with the easy comfort of someone who had done this many times before. They talked about the market and the best cycle to go. They talked about the strange clicking sound the houses made just before dawn, which Tyven explained was completely normal, and related to how the organic building materials responded to temperature changes. They talked about the food and the light and the length of the days. And then Daniel asked about Sarah. He tried to make it casual. He said, "The neighbor next door. The one with the red skin. She seems interesting." Tyven stopped talking. He put his glass down very slowly. He looked at Daniel with his black eyes and he said, quietly, "You spoke to her?" Daniel said yes. "Just a quick introduction. She seemed friendly enough." Tyven was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Daniel, I am going to tell you something and I need you to hear it very carefully. That woman next door is not just a local resident. She is not just someone who lives on this street. Do you understand what I am saying?" Daniel said he did not. Tyven leaned forward. He said, "Her full name, her real name, not the short version she gives to make people comfortable, is a title as much as a name. It translates into most languages as something like the Eternal Queen of the Calvaran Dominion, but that does not fully describe it either. The Calvaran Dominion is not a country. It is not a planet. It is not even a galaxy. It is every system, every sector, every inhabited world across 9 galaxies. And she is the one who rules all of it." Daniel sat very still. He said, "All of it?" Tyven said, "Every single part. She has ruled for over 4,000 years, before the current age of the galactic community, before the treaties, before most of the species currently alive in this part of the universe had even developed language. She was already ruling." Daniel looked out his window at the house next door. The lights inside were on, a soft, warm amber glow behind the frosted windows. He said, "Why is she living here?" Tyven shook his head slowly. He said, "Nobody knows. She has a palace on Calvera Prime that is the size of a small moon. She has estates on 40 different worlds. She has staff and guards, and an entire administrative network that runs the largest empire in recorded galactic history." He paused. Then he said, "And she chose to live in a house at the end of a quiet lane on a small residential planet in the outer rim." He picked his glass back up. He said, "And now she has spoken to you." He took a long, slow drink. He said, "I have lived here for 12 years. She has never once spoken to me." Daniel did not sleep well that night. He lay on his bed in the quiet house and stared at the ceiling and tried to arrange what Tyven had told him into some kind of shape that made sense. But there was no shape for it. There was no frame he could put around the idea of the woman next door being 4,000 years old and ruling 9 galaxies, and somehow choosing to live in a modest house on a quiet lane, on a planet that most of the galactic community apparently considered pleasantly unremarkable. He kept coming back to the smile. It was small and controlled, but it was real. He was certain of that. He had spent enough time around people to know the difference between a real smile and a polite one. And hers had been real, which, if anything, made the whole thing more confusing. He got up early and made his tea and stood at the front window and watched the Verada sun come up slow and pale over the rooftops. Sarah's garden was empty. Her lights were off. He went about his day. He walked to the market. He got his bread substitute, and something that the stall owner assured him was equivalent to eggs, and tasted close enough that he decided not to examine the question too carefully. He walked back slowly, taking the long route through the residential lanes, watching the neighborhood with new eyes. He started to notice things he had missed before. The house at the end of the lane, Sarah's house, was slightly different from the others. Not dramatically, not obviously, but the garden wall was built differently. The stones were older and darker, and fit together with a precision that the other walls on the lane did not have. The plants near her gate were not the same stubby three-leafed things that grew in every other garden. They were taller, darker. They had a faint luminescence to them that he had initially attributed to the angle of the light, but now recognized as something internal. The house itself sat slightly apart from its neighbors, not because of physical distance. The gap between her property and the next one was no wider than any other, but there was a quality to that distance that felt deliberate, like a perimeter, like a choice. He was passing back through the lane when her front door opened. She stepped out in a long dark coat, the collar turned up, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was carrying something small in one hand, a narrow device of some kind, black and smooth. She saw him immediately. She said, "Daniel Carr, are you exploring?" He said, "Just coming back from the market." She looked at the bag in his hand. She said, "You went to the eastern stall." He said, "Yes." She said, "The one on the south side is better for humans. They import from the Terran supply lines." He said, "I did not know that." She said, "Most new residents do not. It takes time to learn." There was a pause, a natural one, not awkward, just present. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him with those silver eyes and said, "You may ask. I may not answer." He said, "How long have you lived here?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 2 of your Earth years, more or less." He said, "Did you always plan to live here?" She tilted her head slightly. She said, "I planned many things. Living here was not always one of them." He wanted to ask more. He could feel the questions lined up behind his teeth like a crowd trying to get through a door. But something in her stillness, not coldness, just precision, made him hold them back. He said, "Thank you for the tip about the south stall." She said, "You are welcome, Daniel Carr." She walked past him down the lane, her coat moving slowly around her, her dark hair catching the pale light. He watched her go, and then he walked home and ate his not-quite eggs and thought about everything Tyven had told him, and tried to reconcile the woman who had just given him a grocery recommendation with the being who had ruled 9 galaxies for 4,000 years. He could not do it. Not yet. But over the days that followed, something shifted. They began to talk. Not long conversations, not deep ones. Short exchanges at the garden wall in the mornings. A word or two when they passed in the lane. She asked him once what tea was, and he explained it, and she listened with the same focused and precise attention she brought to everything, and then nodded once as if filing the information, carefully away. He asked her once what she was holding in her hands every morning in the garden. She showed him. It was a small sphere, dark and smooth, no bigger than a marble. It sat in her palm, and turned slowly of its own accord. Inside it, he could see something moving. Stars, tiny and perfect. An entire galaxy rendered in miniature, rotating slowly in her hand. She said, "It is a monitoring system. I use it to observe systems under my administration." He said, "Is that one real?" She said, "All of them are real." He stared at the tiny spinning stars. He said, "How many are there?" She said, "Across all 9 territories, Approximately 400 billion inhabited systems. He said nothing. She closed her fingers around the sphere. She said, "Most mornings I only need to check on a few hundred of them. It is a quiet time of year." He looked up at her. She held his gaze. And then she said, in a tone so matter-of-fact it almost made him laugh, "I find the mornings here pleasant. The light is good." She turned and went back inside. He stood at the wall with the ghost of 400 billion stars still printed behind his eyes. And somewhere in that moment, without quite deciding to, he stopped being afraid of her. A month passed. The quiet conversations continued. They grew slightly longer each time, like something slowly opening. Sarah was precise in everything she said. She never wasted words. She never filled silence just to fill it. She said what she meant, and meant what she said, and when she did not want to answer a question, she said so directly, with a calm simplicity that Daniel found he respected enormously. He started to look forward to the morning garden conversations in a way that surprised him. He told himself it was just because she was interesting. And she was. She was the most interesting person he had ever met. Her knowledge of history, actual history, spanning thousands of years and hundreds of civilizations, was extraordinary. She referenced events the way someone might mention something they watched on the news last week. Casually. Precisely. Without any drama. She mentioned once, in passing, that she had attended the signing of the Galactic Accord. He knew from his integration reading that the Galactic Accord was the foundational treaty that had established interspecies cooperation across the known galaxy. It was 4,000 years old. He said, "You were there?" She said, "I drafted 3 of the clauses." He said nothing. She looked at him with a faint expression that might have been amusement. She said, "You are doing the math." He said, 4,000 years old. She said, "Approximately. Our concept of age is somewhat different from yours." He said, "You do not look 4,000 years old." She said, "Thank you." I think. That was the first time he made her laugh. It was not a big laugh. It was brief and quiet, but it was completely real, and it changed something in the air between them. Some formal, invisible distance that had been there since the beginning shifted slightly, and did not shift back. He asked her once, carefully, why she had left. Not forever, not away from her role, but why she was here. Why Verada? Why this lane? Why this house? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "Have you ever been responsible for something so large that the weight of it never fully leaves you?" He said, "Not on that scale." She said, "No, I suppose not." She paused. She said, "When you are responsible for everything, you carry everything. Every decision, every consequence, every life that changes because of what you chose or did not choose. It does not stop. It never fully stops." She looked out across the lane at the pale morning sky. She said, "I came here because this is a place where very little needs me, where the morning is just a morning, where I can stand in a garden and hold a small sphere and check on a few hundred systems and then put it away and have tea." He said, "You have been having tea?" She said, "I tried it. It is less impressive than you described." He said, "You have to add milk." She said, "I know. I am trying to decide if I want to." He smiled. She looked at him, and for a moment, in the pale morning light of a planet 47 light-years from Manchester, 2 people on opposite ends of every possible scale of power and experience in history stood at a low stone wall and talked about tea. And it felt, somehow, like the most natural thing in the world. But not everything stayed quiet. 3 weeks after that conversation, something changed. He was in his house, late evening, when he heard it. Not the soft, almost music she sometimes made in her garden. Something else. Lower. A vibration that was less sound and more pressure. A feeling in the walls and the floor and the air itself, as if the planet was holding its breath. He went to his window. The lane outside was empty. The evening was still. But next door, Sarah's house was lit differently than usual. The windows were not the soft amber they normally showed. They were bright, pure white, and through the frosted glass he could see moving shapes, multiple figures, tall and formal, moving through the rooms inside. He watched. After 20 minutes, the front door opened. 3 figures stepped out. They were tall, taller than Tyven, dressed in dark formal clothing that caught no light at all. Their faces were obscured by visors that reflected everything around them without giving anything away. They stood in her garden for a moment, looking up and down the lane with a careful, systematic attention that made Daniel step back from his window. Then Sarah stepped out behind them. She was different. She was dressed differently. Gone was the simple dark coat. She wore something structured and formal, something that moved with her and caught the light in complex ways, that made her seem larger somehow, more present, more real than anything around her. Her hair was arranged differently. Her posture was different. Even from across the lane, even through his frosted window, she seemed to take up more space than before. She looked like what she was. Not his neighbor. Not the woman at the garden wall who talked about tea, the queen. The 3 figures bowed to her, deep and precise and absolute. They spoke to her for several minutes. She listened with her hands clasped behind her back and her face completely still. Then she said something, brief and final, and they bowed again and left, moving down the lane so quickly they were gone before Daniel could track where they went. Sarah stood in her garden alone for a moment. Then she turned and looked directly at his window. He had stepped back. He was not sure she could see him in the dark interior of his house, but somehow he felt certain she could. She looked at his window for 3 seconds. Then she went back inside. He stood in his dark house and breathed, and realized, for the first time with absolute clarity, that the woman at the wall who had told him about the South Market stall and laughed at his joke about milk and discussed the length of the Verada day with the ease of an ordinary neighbor, was also the woman who had just received formal envoys from what was presumably a galactic empire, and dismissed them in under 10 minutes. Both things were true at the same time. He did not know how to hold both things. But he knew, standing in his dark house with the white light from next door slowly fading back to amber, that he was going to have to figure it out. He knocked on her door the next morning. He had not planned to. He had spent the night deciding not to, then deciding to, then deciding not to again. He got up early and made his tea and stood at his window and watched her garden and told himself he was going to say nothing, ask nothing, that it was none of his business what happened next door. Then he put down his mug and walked to her front door and knocked. She opened it almost immediately, as if she had been expecting him. She was back in her simple dark robe. Her hair was loose. She looked completely herself again. But he could not unsee what he had seen the night before. The formality, the presence, the absolute authority in every line of her posture. He said, "I saw them, last night, the people who came." She looked at him for a moment, then she stepped back and said, "Come in." He had never been inside her house before. It was larger than his, not enormously so, but the proportions were different. The ceilings higher, the room slightly wider, and the light inside was the same soft amber he had seen from outside, but warmer up close, like late afternoon sun filtered through old glass. The furniture was spare and precise. A long, low table, a wide chair, shelves on one wall lined with objects he could not identify, and on a narrow stand near the window, a larger version of the sphere from the garden, turning slowly, full of light. She gestured to a chair. He sat. She stood near the window, her hands clasped behind her back, and she said, "You want to know what they wanted?" He said, "I want to know if you are all right." She looked at him. For a moment her expression was completely unreadable, and then something crossed it. Something brief and complicated that he almost missed. Something that was not quite surprise. Something softer than that. She said, "Yes, I am all right." He said, "And what they wanted?" She sat down across from him. She said, "There is an administrative situation. In one of the border territories. It requires my attention." He said, "How serious?" She said, "Serious enough that they sent 3 envoys instead of a message." He said, "Are you going to go?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, I always go. That is the nature of what I am. She said it simply. No bitterness. No resentment. Just a statement of fact. The way you might say I always lock the door or I always make tea in the morning. He said, does it ever stop? The being needed? She looked at him with those silver eyes and said, no, it does not. She paused. She said, that is not a complaint. I want to be clear about that. I chose this. I chose it a very long time ago, and I would choose it again. He said, but you still needed somewhere to come. She held his gaze. She said yes. The word sat in the room between them, quiet and honest. He said, is that what this is? Verada. This neighborhood. She said, it is where I remember who I am when I am not being what I am required to be. He thought about that. He thought about his flat in Manchester and his clicking radiator, and his Sunday calls with his mom and his life in the gray middle space between happiness and unhappiness. He thought about what had made him tap the link in that advertisement, what had made him sign the form and pay the deposit and pack the bags and move 47 light years from everything he knew. He said, I think I understand that more than you might expect. She looked at him. He said, I came here for the same reason. Not the same scale, obviously, but the same reason. I needed somewhere that was something different. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I know why you came. He said, how? She said, I read your application. Before you arrived. He stared at her. He said, the relocation application? She said, all new residents are reviewed. It is a formality. The sector administration sends a summary to my office. He said, your office reviews new neighbors. She said, in this sector. Yes, he said. Did you choose me? She looked at him steadily. She said, the application process is independent. I do not select residents. He said, that is not what I asked. She held his gaze. And then, carefully she said, I may have indicated a preference that the property next door remain available for a human candidate with a certain profile. He sat back. He said, why? She said, because I wanted a neighbor I could talk to. Not a subject. Not an official. Not someone who would look at me the way Tyven looks at me, as if I might accidentally end the world if he says the wrong thing. She paused. She said, I wanted someone ordinary. Someone real. Someone who would tell me about tea and complain about door handles, and look out their window in the morning with a face that said this is strange and wonderful, and I have no idea what I am doing. He said nothing. She said, you looked like that. In your application photograph. You had that face. He said, you chose me because of my face? She said, I chose you because you looked like someone who was willing to be somewhere new without pretending it was not new. That is rarer than you think. He looked at her. The queen of 9 galaxies who had chosen a house at the end of a quiet lane and wanted a neighbor who was honest about being lost. He said, I did not know any of this. She said, no. You were not supposed to yet. He said, yet. She held his gaze and said, yet. The envoys came back. 4 of them this time. 2 days after his visit to her house, they arrived at dawn, before the Verada sun had fully cleared the rooftops, and they stood in her garden in their light-absorbing clothing and waited with a stillness that was entirely unlike anything human. Daniel watched from his window. Sarah came to the door. She was dressed formally. The structured clothing again. The different posture. The quality of presence that made everything around her seem slightly smaller by comparison. She listened to the 4 figures with her hands at her sides and her face absolutely still. Then she said something that made all 4 of them step back. Not in fear. In acknowledgement. In the particular kind of deference that is reserved for something that has simply decided and will not be changed. She went back inside. The 4 figures stood in her garden for a long moment. Then they left. 30 minutes later, she knocked on his door. She was still formally dressed. But her expression was the one he knew. The morning expression. The one that belonged to the neighbor at the wall. She said, "May I come in?" He said yes. She sat in his kitchen while he made tea. She did not speak while he boiled the water and arranged the cups. He put the milk on the table, and she looked at it with a measured consideration, and then added some to her cup, and wrapped her hands around it, and sat quietly. He sat across from her. She said, "I have to go." He said, "The border territory." She said, "It has escalated. I need to be there." He said, "How long?" She said, "Months. Possibly longer." He nodded slowly. She said, "I want to tell you something before I go. Something I should have said before." He looked at her. She said, "I have ruled for 4,000 years. I have made decisions that changed the course of civilizations. I have ended wars and started peace processes and reshaped the borders of empires. I have done all of that. And I will keep doing it. That is not something I question." She paused. She said, "But in 2 years on this planet, in this neighborhood, in these morning conversations at a low stone wall, I have been more honest than I have been in a very long time. Maybe longer." He said, "Honest about what?" She said, "About what it feels like to carry all of it. About what it is like to be what I am. I do not say those things to my advisors. I do not say them to my administrators. I certainly do not say them to the envoys who come in formal clothing before dawn." She looked at her tea. She said, "I said them to you. An ordinary man from Manchester who moved to the edge of the galaxy because he needed something different." He said, "Is that strange?" "To you?" She said, "It is the strangest thing that has happened to me in 4,000 years." She said it without irony, without drama, just as a fact. He said, "When you come back." She looked at him. He said, "When you come back from the border territory, I will still be here, making tea badly, probably still confused by the door handles." She looked at him for a long moment, those silver eyes full of something ancient and quiet and real. She said, "I know. That is why I am coming back." She finished her tea. She put the cup down carefully. She stood. At his door she paused. She said, "One more thing." He said, "Yes?" She said, "The South Market stall. On Thursdays they get the good bread, the real kind, not the substitute." He said, "I will remember that." She said, "Good." She walked down his front path and through her own front door, and the amber light behind her windows changed to white and then after a long time went dark. He stood in his kitchen with 2 empty cups and the quiet clicking of a house settling around him. She was the most powerful being in the galaxy. She ruled 9 territories and 400 billion inhabited systems, and she had been doing it for longer than most civilizations had existed. And she was coming back, to the house at the end of a quiet lane, to the low stone wall between their gardens, to the morning light of a small, unremarkable planet, at the edge of everything. To have tea and talk about nothing, and everything, and to be, for a few hours every day, just a neighbor. He washed the cups. He put them away. He stood at his front window and looked out at the empty lane and the rust-colored soil, and the pale silver morning of Verada coming up slow and steady over the rooftops. And for the first time since he had arrived 47 light years from Manchester, he felt completely at home. Here is the thing nobody talks about when they tell stories about power. Power does not make you less human, or less whatever you are. It does not remove the need for connection, or honesty, or the particular kind of peace that comes from standing in a garden in the morning light, with nothing required of you for just a few minutes. Sarah had ruled for 4,000 years. She had shaped the course of galactic history. She had made decisions that altered the lives of species across 9 territories. She carried all of that, every day, without putting it down. And she had come to a quiet planet, at the edge of everything, because she needed a place where the morning was just a morning. Daniel had left Manchester because the gray middle space had started to feel like something was missing. He did not know what. He just knew that tapping a link on a Tuesday afternoon in November was the first decision in a long time that felt completely his own. He moved next door to the most powerful being in the galaxy, and she was, in the ways that mattered most, Exactly what she appeared to be in those morning conversations at the wall. Precise. Honest. Curious. Tired sometimes. Carrying more than anyone should have to carry. Real. The twist, the thing that nobody sees coming in a story like this, is not that she is powerful. It is that power did not change what she needed. 4,000 years of ruling everything, and she still needed someone who would say, "Come in," and put the kettle on and ask if she was all right. That is not a weakness. That is the most human thing in the galaxy, regardless of what species you belong to. Daniel's story did not end when she left. He stayed on Verada. He learned the South Market stall and got the good bread on Thursdays and had long conversations with Tyven about nothing and everything, and slowly, steadily, built a life in a place that was nothing like Manchester, and better in ways he could not have predicted. And she came back, 6 months later, on a morning when the Verada sun came up pale and silver, and the rust-colored soil in the garden was damp from the night before. She knocked on his door. He made 2 cups of tea. He put the milk on the table. She sat down and wrapped her hands around her cup, and for a long time neither of them said anything. And that, more than anything else, was the story. 2 people. One ordinary. One anything but. Living at the end of the same quiet lane and choosing, every morning, to be honest with each other. In a universe of 400 billion inhabited systems, that might seem like the smallest possible thing. But Daniel Carr from Manchester would tell you it was the biggest thing he ever witnessed. If this story opened your eyes to the kind of universe that might be waiting beyond what we can see, you are going to want to stay close. Because this is only the beginning of what is out there. So let us bring it all together. Daniel Carr moved to the edge of the galaxy because he needed something different. He found it in the form of the most powerful being in the known universe, who needed the exact same thing. She had ruled 9 galaxies for 4,000 years, and still needed somewhere to put the weight down for a while. And he, an ordinary man with loud tea and misaligned door handles, turned out to be exactly the right neighbor for a queen who had everything except someone willing to talk to her like she was just a person. The lesson is not about power. It is not about how extraordinary the universe is, though it absolutely is. The lesson is simpler than that. Connection is the thing that survives everything. Across every species, across every scale of power and experience and history, the need to be seen and spoken to honestly is the most durable thing in existence. And sometimes the most important relationships in your life begin at a low stone wall, with a simple greeting and a mispronounced word. If you made it all the way through this story, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. People who want the big questions. People who want to think about what is possible. People who are willing to move 47 light years in their imagination and see what they find there. So here is what I need from you right now. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it tells the algorithm that this kind of story matters, which means more people get to find it, and that is always a good thing. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New stories come out regularly and every single one is built for people who want more than the ordinary. And then go watch the next video. It is already waiting for you. It picks up somewhere even stranger and even more extraordinary than today's story, and I promise you it is worth every minute. One last thing before you go. I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me this. If you could move to any planet in the galaxy and your neighbor turned out to be the most powerful being in the universe, what is the first thing you would say to them? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And the best answers might just end up inspiring the next story. Thank you for being here. The universe is bigger than anyone told you. And the best stories are always the ones that happen next door.